Good morning, friends, and welcome again to Sheffield Vineyard. I'm Matt. If you don't know me, I'm on the staff team here at SV. Now, we're starting a three-part series on justice and compassion that we're calling Just Do It. Over the next three talks, we're going to explore what the Bible teaches about how to interact with injustice and what we can do with God to bring justice in the world. At Sheffield Vineyard, we have a little saying, which is that we want to be a city that is full of life and that is full of people who are full of life. Justice and compassion are absolutely central to this calling, and we are invited to not just understand what this looks like, but to actively live radical and transformative lives as we follow Jesus. Now, there's so many places in the Bible that we can learn about God's care for the poor and marginalized. In fact, there are 2,000 verses in the Bible about poverty and justice. We can't go through every single one, so we're going to have a look at Luke chapter 4, and it's going to come up along the bottom, starting at verse 18. Now, to set the scene, this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He's been tempted in the wilderness and baptized by John. And he goes into his hometown and he reads this passage from the Old Testament to the people who are gathered there. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." At the beginning of his ministry, Jesus declared that he is bringing about a new kingdom or a new way of living. And central to this new way of living is good news for the poor. Now, I'm hoping that this sounds pretty radical to you, and that's because it is. The beginning of Jesus' message is not 4 steps to better spiritual health or do these 3 mental exercises to be right with God. It is an invitation to be part of a restoration and renewal of the entire cosmos. So what actually is justice? In the Bible, the word for justice is associated with doing the right action. Now, this right action is found all throughout the story of God in the Bible. And to get a definition for justice, we're going to go right to the beginning. In Genesis chapter 1, it says at verse 26, "Then God said, 'Let us make humans in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.'" God said, "Let us make humans in our image, in our likeness." Now, it's important to know that for the writers of Genesis, this was a radical statement. They lived in a world where only the rulers of countries were thought of as the images of God, and everyone else was much less than that. And this statement in Genesis 1 declares that every human being, no matter what their circumstance, is a highly prized image bearer of God. And this really gets at the heart of what justice in the kingdom of God looks like. Justice is when we treat each other as images of God that we actually are. Now, what does that mean in the nitty-gritty of day-to-day living? It means that sexism, racism, fear of the other, and all these things that divide people are views that just cannot be maintained in a life that follows Jesus. It means that objectification, manipulation, extortion, and violence are all serious affronts to the heart of God. Ouch. Now, this can feel overwhelming, but Jesus offers a practical answer for how we are going to live just lives. He says in Mark chapter 12, starting at verse 30, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength." And this is the second command that is most important. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. So as we love God with everything we are, we see his vision for a just world, And we see that our part in it is to recognize each person we come across as an incomprehensibly valuable and beautiful image bearer of God. This command is relational and it's restorative. The good news is that this is how God wants to bring about his kingdom. Our relationship with God has been restored through Jesus' death and resurrection, which means that our relationships with each other can be restored, our relationship to the planet can be restored, our relationship to ourselves can be restored. Our politics, our healthcare, our education, our social structures can be, are being, and will be transformed by God's power to act in accordance to his kingship. So we have an idea of what justice means, but what do we mean by compassion? It's worth noting that they are different, and we're called to do both. Our word for compassion comes from the Latin that means to suffer with, and in Hebrew, which is the language that the Old Testament was written in, the word compassion has associations with the way that a parent feels for their child. It also comes from the word womb, and this paints a powerful image of a deep conviction to come alongside people in their moment of need. There are several moments in the Bible where Jesus is said to be moved with compassion. These moments are immediately before he does something to meet that person's need, whether it's healing them, teaching, or feeding them. When we live compassionately, we see and meet people's needs. Like Jesus, this can be as small as buying a cup of coffee for a homeless person, or as large as feeding an entire city. The trick with compassion is that we feel something and then we act. It doesn't require much more than that. And in my experience, compassion is easier to do than justice. It's simpler, isn't it? Although it makes me nervous, it's easier to buy a snack for someone on the street than it is to identify and call out systems of oppression that have created an environment where people can become homeless. For a while, I thought I could do compassion without doing justice. And the reality is this just didn't work. Without justice, our compassion can become exhausting and disheartening. It can also be dehumanizing in that we see people as needs to be met and tasks to perform rather than as images of God. Similarly, without compassion, justice can become sterile and distant. Again, we can forget that we are dealing with real, full human beings rather than issues, statistics, or life circumstances. We need to live lives filled with both compassion and justice if we are serious about following what Jesus teaches about loving our neighbour and partaking in the arrival of God's kingdom on earth. If you hadn't noticed, justice and compassion are doing words. Whilst we've talked about some broad ideas of what these mean, most of this is figured out on the ground, in the doing of it. And my experience of us at Sheffield Vineyard is that there are so many people doing so many good things, and that's amazing. Let's keep encouraging each other in that, and let's also copy each other and get stuck in with what each other are doing as we journey towards justice and compassion. But with that in mind, I've gathered together my top 3 picks to get us started if maybe this is all very new to you and you're thinking, well, where do I go? What do I do now? Now, our first challenge, where it all kicks off, I think, is to see people. In my experience, it's so easy to miss the needs of people who are physically close to us. This is something that we have to work at because our society and culture actively works to hide need, whether it's by making benches that are hard to sleep on, finding people for begging, or cladding run-down looking buildings. Jesus saw the people who are at the bottom and the margins of society and paid attention to them. One of the stories that moves me most about Jesus is when he allows himself to be interrupted by a woman at the very bottom rung of society whilst he's on his way to heal the daughter of a synagogue leader. He stops, notices the most outcast and marginalized person in the crowd, and calls her daughter. So let's learn to really see people. I recommend praying when you're out and about in the city and asking God to draw your attention towards the marginalized. It's so easy to be too busy to notice, so maybe slow down. Maybe you can give yourself a couple of extra minutes on your journey time. And if you volunteer in the food bank, or you are like buying someone a coffee who's sleeping rough, then take a moment to hear their story, not as a means to fix their problems, but as an exercise in affirming and noticing that they are people who bear the image of God with them. And we're going to have a quick think about what it means to live compassionately. And my advice for compassion is very, very simple. It's to do something, and it's to start right now. As we learn to take notice of people, God will grow a deep-seated emotional yearning in us called compassion. Now, we don't want to fight that. We want to use that and get stuck in. My advice would be to join in with people who are already doing great work in this city. And there are 3 reasons for this. The first being that it's much, much easier to sustain. We want to be in the business of becoming compassionate people who live compassionate lives. And having a space where you can regularly volunteer, even when you're not in the mood, helps turn this passion into a way of living. Because trust me, after a while of doing this, there are some days where you're just not in the mood. The other reason to get stuck in with organizations is that we can learn to serve really well. The reality is that our world is really complicated and nuanced. There are so many things that we can do which are actually unhelpful and unkind to the people who are most at need. Joining with organizations and groups of people who've been doing these compassionate things for longer than us is a place that we can learn. The first thing I did when I was employed by Sheffield Vineyard about 18 months ago to take charge of our compassion and justice ministries was to go and volunteer at a food bank at another church called St. Thomas Philadelphia. And I learned on the job and got as close as I could to the guys who were running that as possible for 6 months. I just asked questions and helped where I could and was attentive to how they cared for and loved people. I still volunteer there now, and it's a joy to now be in the position to invite and apprentice people as they begin their journey towards living compassionately. And the third reason for getting stuck in with an organisation is that we get to do it together. It's more fun to do this as community. God has made us to work together to bring his kingdom about. You don't need to go it alone. And if you want to go far in this, you just can't go it alone. Here are a couple of highlights of the kind of organisations that you could get involved with, and these are people who just off the top of my head are working right now, like today in Sheffield, and would be looking for volunteers. So there's our food bank in partnership with the S6 food bank. There's also the charity Assist, who work with asylum seekers. There's also the charity Christians Against Poverty, who generally work with people in debt and other financial crisis. There's a charity called BESOM, who help furnish people's houses when they've come out of maybe domestic abuse or prison situations. Or there's the Archer Project at the Cathedral, which works with people who have been made homeless in the city. And there are so many more than that. If you have a passion for a certain group of people or a certain kind of need, I'm confident that there are currently Christians in the city who are already serving that need. So get stuck in with them. And if you don't feel passionate, specifically passionate about a specific thing, then I recommend you just pick something and just give it a whack. So that's living compassionately. But what about justice? How do we do this justice stuff? Now, justice begins with how we act and not what we say. The reality is that individually, we just don't have the power to tackle big issues like environmental destruction or injustice in the textile industry or the millions of things that we see wrong with our world. However, we are invited to use the power that we have in a way which pursues justice. And one thing that I'm confident that we all do is buy stuff. I know this because you're watching this on a device you bought, and I'm confident that none of us are currently naked, and I'm sure that we've bought food at least one point in our life. So let's live justly in how we spend our money. I'm sure this isn't new to most of us, but maybe let's try to commit to buying fair trade food or buying food that has come locally and only buying the things we need. If we can, maybe let's try to know where our clothes and other stuff that we use day to day is coming from. I'm gonna shout out Lydia Woodland for introducing me to an app called Good on You. And that gathers together all of the information about clothing companies and how ethical they are with a whole load of factors. Now, the good news about this is that there are companies who are actively pursuing a fair and just way of making clothes. But the challenge with this is that there's a lot of places that aren't. And for about 2 years, I had a real difficulty purchasing any clothes, which is why I look so disheveled and only own a couple of jumpers. And in my experience, working this just living out can be a really fun and creative process. Karen introduced me to a washing egg, which is a sustainable and eco-friendly way of washing your clothes, which just also happens to be cheaper, but that's another thing. And now the reality is that we can't do this perfectly. Our economy is saturated in injustice, but there is grace for the journey that we embark on. So let's encourage and champion each other in these things. There's no need for competitiveness or judgment as we pursue justice together. So as we come into land and pray together, I have one final encouragement, and that is to be with God. As we start to look at how to live lives of justice and compassion, we can feel driven to do everything. Sometimes we leave behind the King, Jesus, in pursuit of his kingdom, justice. So spend time with God, because God is just so good. If you can, take a day once a week where you can stop doing anything to rest and enjoy life with God. Some of us call this a Sabbath. If you can't manage a day, then maybe carve out a morning or an hour or two. As with all these things, regular time with God without an agenda is a non-negotiable when we're pursuing what he calls us to live.